Disclaimer. All stories presented in this video are either fictional or based on accounts submitted by viewers, authors. Any resemblance to actual events, people, or places is purely coincidental. This video is created solely for entertainment or educational purposes. The opinions expressed in this video are subjective and do not claim to represent absolute truth. Thank you for watching.
Story 1. Ben, have you ever seen my friend? When my son Ben was 4 years old, I noticed that he often talked about some friend he spent time with. At first, I thought it was just an imaginary friend. Many kids at that age have them. But when Ben started describing this friend, I began to worry. He wasn't just talking about playing with him, he was giving very specific details. He said his friend looked like a little boy with long black hair, always dressed in dark clothes. He even described the place where they played, our backyard, but Ben said that it was always very dark there, even when the sun was shining. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just a child's fantasy, but one day Ben said, "My friend doesn't want to go home. He leaves his things here and doesn't want to leave my house." This really freaked me out, because I couldn't understand why he kept saying this. But the strangest part came a few days later when Ben never mentioned his friend again. It was like he completely forgot about him, and as if nothing ever happened. We even moved to a new house, and Ben never spoke about that friend again. I still can't forget those words, and I don't know what to make of what he experienced.
Story 2. Mom, I've been here before. My little daughter Kate was always very curious and inquisitive. When she was 3 years old, we went to a new neighborhood to visit relatives. We passed by several streets, and suddenly, Kate started saying, "Mom, I've been here before. This place feels very familiar." At first, I thought it was just her childish imagination, but she insisted that this place was very familiar to her. She even started pointing out certain houses and claiming that she remembered them. It was strange because we had never been to this neighborhood before. I tried to explain to her that this was a new place and that she must be confused. But Kate was persistent. "No, Mom, I've been here before, but that's not my car." She even described how the street looked, even though I was sure she had never seen it before. And the most interesting part was that a few days later, when we went back to my mom's, Kate repeated the same thing but with new words. "We've been here before. I saw this place when I was little." It really confused me because she was so young and couldn't possibly remember past trips. I still have a hard time believing it was just imagination.
Story 3. Dad, I hear his voice. My son Jake was always very calm and didn't like to dramatize things. But one day he started waking up in the middle of the night and saying he heard voices. At first, I thought it was just bad dreams, but over time he began describing these voices in great detail. He said he heard voices calling him by name, even though there was no one in the room. I asked him who it might be, and he replied, "It's that man with the dark face." This description worried me because Jake was very specific. He's standing in the corner and just staring at me. I tried to calm him down, even explaining that it could just be dreams, but he was very convinced of his words. The next day, Jake talked again about the man with the dark face, and I couldn't bring myself to believe it was just imagination. He pointed to a specific corner in the room and even said that this man doesn't want to leave. I asked if he wanted us to do something, but he simply said that the man couldn't leave the room without permission. This went on for a few weeks until Jake stopped mentioning him. He just forgot about it, and I never heard about that dark man again. I still can't explain what happened.
Story 4. Mom, I remember how we died. When my son Alex was 5 years old, he started saying strange things that really surprised me. One day, after we watched a film about life after death, he said, "Mom, I remember how we died." I was stunned and asked him what he meant. He just looked at me seriously and explained. We died a long time ago. You, me, and everyone else. I remember how it happened. I tried to reassure him, but he kept going, as if it was the most normal thing in the world. He said he remembered that we were different people in another place. I asked him if it was just a fantasy, but Alex was very convinced of his words. He even named places where, according to him, we had lived before, and even mentioned people I didn't recognize. When I asked where he knew that from, he simply replied, I remember how it was. We were all together in another world, but then we came back here. It was a strange moment, and I couldn't find a logical explanation for what was going on.
5. The people with the light on their heads. My little daughter, Lily, was always very imaginative and often made up new stories, but what she began to tell me made me stop and think. One evening, while we were sitting at home, she suddenly looked out the window and said, Mom, I see them. The people with the light on their heads. I didn't immediately understand who she was talking about because there were no unusual people in our neighborhood, and we lived in a quiet suburban area. Lily continued, They come from the forest, and when they walk, their heads glow, like fireflies. I tried to convince her that it was just her imagination, but she was incredibly certain that she was seeing someone who flies at night. She described them as tall, thin people in white clothing, with some kind of transparent hands that seemed to disappear into the air as they moved. I began to worry whether she was dreaming this, or if it was just her fantasies. But when we later went on a hike in the forest, Lily pointed to certain trees and said that's where they appear and disappear. This was even stranger because my family and I had never walked those paths. I couldn't understand if this was just a child's tale or something much more mysterious. A few weeks later, Lily no longer mentioned these people, but I often think about her words and wonder if she really saw something beyond her imagination.
Story 6. I met Grandma in the forest. My little daughter, Sarah, was always very curious and loved spending time outdoors, especially in the forest near our house. One day she came home and said, Mom, I met Grandma in the forest. At first I thought it was just a made-up story or one of her fantasies, but when she started telling me more, I began to wonder. Sarah described a woman who looked very much like my mother, even though my mother had passed away several years ago. She said this grandma was wearing a white dress that glowed and that she was very kind. Sarah even mentioned that the grandma told her she would see her again in our house and that she would be there to protect her. I tried to reassure Sarah and asked what else she remembered, but she was incredibly clear in her descriptions. Grandma said I have to be strong because it's important for our family. However, when I asked her if she had seen this woman before, Sarah just said, this grandma was different, but still familiar. I was confused. How could a child describe someone so accurately if she couldn't have seen them? A few days later, Sarah never mentioned this encounter again, but I still can't shake the feeling that she really met someone I don't know anything about.
Story 7. I saw you in another life. When my son Liam was just 4 years old, he started saying some strange things that really surprised me. One day we were walking in the park together when he suddenly stopped, looked at me and said, Mom, I saw you in another life. I was stunned and didn't know how to respond because he was still too young to understand such things. I asked him what he meant, and he replied, We've already been together, but it was in a different place. I remember how we lived there. Liam explained that in that life we were different people, and even named places I had never heard of. He told me how we lived in a big city on another continent, and how life there was completely different. I couldn't understand why he kept repeating this and describing our lives in another place. I asked him where he knew all this from, but he just said, I remember how it was. It was a long time ago and we were together, but we came back here. It was so unusual that I began to worry whether he had some past memories that I couldn't explain. This lasted for a few days, but then Liam stopped mentioning it again, and I started to believe it was just part of his childhood imagination. But sometimes, when I think about it, I start to question if it was really just a fantasy.
Story 8. This isn't my hand. My little Mia was always a very calm and serious child, but one day she started saying some very strange things. She was sitting next to me when she suddenly took her hand and said, "This isn't my hand, it's the hand of another girl." I thought she was just playing, but her facial expression was so serious that I began to worry. I asked her who she was talking about, and she replied, "This hand belongs to another girl, and I'm taking it to help her." Then she began to describe how this other girl would come and take her hand, and they would play games I couldn't understand. Mia even pointed to a specific part of the room and said, "This is where she leaves her hand, and then I take it." This went on for several weeks, and although Mia no longer mentioned it, I still felt something was off. How could a child speak so seriously about someone else's hand? And why was she so persistent that the hand wasn't hers? I still don't have answers to these questions.
Story 9. I Saw You in Another Place. When my son Jack was 4 years old, he began talking about strange things that really confused me. One day, while we were taking a walk in the park, Jack suddenly stopped, looked at me, and said, "Mom, I saw you in another place." At first I thought he was just making it up, but he looked very serious. I asked him where exactly he saw me. He replied, "Where I was very small and you were very old." I was shocked and immediately started asking what he meant. Jack described a city I had never seen, with large buildings and old streets. He said we lived there, but it was so long ago that I no longer remembered. And the most interesting part was what he said. "You were very kind, but you often cried because you were alone." I tried to explain this as just a child's imagination, but Jack was so persistent that he even gave a detailed description of a place I couldn't recall. He even said that we came back, and that we would be together again. It was incredibly strange because he couldn't have had any experience to know such things. He never mentioned it again, but I can't shake the feeling that he really saw something I can't explain.
Story 10. Mum, I remember when I was your dad. My daughter Emily started saying very strange things when she was 3 years old. She always loved to fantasize, but one of her stories really struck me. One day she suddenly said, "Mum, I remember when I was your dad." I thought it was just another child's imagination, but Emily continued to describe how she was my dad. She described how we lived in another place and how she worked to support our family. She mentioned how I was small and how she always tried to comfort me when I was upset. She even added that she was very strong and always protected me from bad people. It was all so detailed and serious that I couldn't just ignore it. I asked her why she remembered these things, and she replied, "It was a long time ago, but I still remember. I was your dad, and we were very happy." After that, she never mentioned it again, but those words stayed with me. Could she really have remembered past lives, or was it just a child's fantasy? I still can't answer that question.
Story 11. I Talked to Your Mom in the Sky. When my son Thomas was 5 years old, he began talking about his grandmother, whom I lost before his birth. He couldn't have known her, but one day while sitting in the car, he suddenly said, "I talked to your mom in the sky." I was shocked and asked what he meant. Thomas explained that when he was in the sky, he saw my mother, and she told him he would be my son, and that he would be very happy in our family. He even added that Grandma told him he came to us on a special mission, and that together we would be very strong. Thomas was so calm and serious that I couldn't take this as just a normal fantasy. I couldn't understand how he could talk about this, since he had never seen my mom and didn't know her story. What amazed me even more was how accurately he described her, a woman with white hair and a kind, gentle look. I don't know what this was, a child's fantasy or something more, but his words left me with inexplicable feelings.
Story 12. I was your friend in another life. My daughter Sophia was always a very curious child, but what she said one day made me stop and think. She suddenly looked at me and said, "Mom, I was your friend in another life." I laughed, thinking it was just another child's fantasy, but Sophia was very serious. She said that in that life, we were part of a team that helped people. She described us as two adults working together on a large project. Sophia said that we were both very important and always helped others, and that we never left each other. She even added that we were there for many years and that we finished everything with great success. I asked her how she knew so much, and she replied, "I remember, Mom. I remember how we worked together, and you were very happy." It was so detailed that I couldn't just ignore these words. I began to wonder whether they were truly memories from the past or just an incredibly realistic imagination. Sophia never mentioned it again, but I still can't shake the feeling that she really remembers something.
Story 13. Grandmother Under the Bed. One time, when I was 25, I worked as a nanny for a wonderful family. Their son Jake was 5 years old, and he had such an imagination that he always amazed me with new stories. But one conversation left me a bit shaken. I was putting Jake to bed one evening. He usually fell asleep quickly, but for some reason that night he was restless, turning and talking. I was sitting at the edge of his bed, gently stroking his head, when he suddenly said, "Sarah, do you see the grandmother too?" I looked at him, confused. "What grandmother, Jake?" "The grandmother under the bed. She's here every night. She told me she loves your red sneakers." I froze. That night, I was indeed wearing red sneakers, which I didn't wear very often. "What do you mean?" I tried to stay calm. Jake started describing. "She's small, with long white hair. She laughs so quietly, almost like a rustle. And she always says she'll protect me if I behave well." Chills ran down my spine. I checked under the bed. Of course, no one was there. The next day, I told his parents about the story. They exchanged quick glances, and then his mom, Molly, said, "That's very strange, but Jake's description reminds me of my grandmother. She passed away 10 years ago. She was always very strict when I was a child, but she always said she was proud of good children. Was it just a coincidence? Maybe. But after that, Jake never mentioned the grandmother under the bed again."
Story 14. Alice's Flying Friend. My nephew Nate has 2 daughters, 6-year-old Alice and 3-year-old Olivia. One time when I was visiting them, Alice came up to me with a very serious expression and said, "Aunt Lindsay, have you ever seen flying people?" I laughed, thinking it was just another one of her fantasies. "No, I haven't. Have you?" Alice nodded and leaned closer to me, whispering, "My friend Jim, he flies." I became curious, so I decided to keep the conversation going. "Jim is your imaginary friend?" She wrinkled her nose as if I had said something silly. "No, he's real. He comes to me at night through the window." I felt a bit uneasy. "And what does he do when he comes?" Alice replied seriously. "We play hide and seek. He's really fast. Sometimes he even disappears. But he always says I don't need to be scared because he's guarding our house from those who hide in the shadows." After this conversation, I couldn't relax. Nate, her dad, just smiled and said it was normal child's imagination. But every time I stayed in their house, I had this strange feeling that someone or something was really watching through the windows.
Story 15. Liam's Mystical Restaurant. My neighbor Liam, a 7-year-old boy, loved telling made-up stories, but once he shared something that seemed a bit too real. We were sitting on the porch when he suddenly said, "I worked in a restaurant when I was old." I was surprised. "What do you mean?" "Well, before I was Liam, I was a cook in a big city. But one day, there was a fire in the restaurant and I couldn't get out. I froze, not knowing how to respond." "Do you remember all of this?" Liam nodded and added, "Yeah, it was a long time ago. But now I'm here and I like being a kid." His mom said he had mentioned this story a few times before, but they decided not to make a big deal out of it. However, every time I pass by a restaurant, I can't help but think about Liam and his strange memory.
Story 16 inches. The Girl in the Green Dress. This story happened to me when I was a caregiver in a daycare in a small town in Virginia. One time, during quiet hour, a 4-year-old girl named Maggie suddenly sat on the bed and said, "Miss Jen, why is that girl sad?" I was surprised because there was no other girl in the room except for those who were sleeping. "What girl, Maggie?" Maggie pointed her finger at an empty corner of the room. "She's standing there, in a green dress. She has curly hair and white shoes. She's crying." I felt chills run down my spine, but I tried to stay calm. "Why is she crying, Maggie?" Maggie thought for a moment and then said, "She lost her mom, and she says she wants to go home." I looked at the corner, even though I knew there was no one there. After this, I decided to talk to the other caregivers. One of them, an elderly woman named Mrs. Clark, said, "That's strange. About 10 years ago, I heard a similar story from another child. She also described a girl in a green dress. Who could it have been?" No one knows, but Maggie never mentioned her again. Still, I never stayed alone in that room again.
Story 17. The Boy on the Street. This story happened to my older brother Michael when his son Henry was 3 years old. One time, as they were driving home, Henry suddenly said, "Dad, do you see that boy?" Michael looked out the window, but there was no one on the side of the road. "What boy, Henry?" "Over there, he's walking along the road. He has a torn shirt, and he looks very sad." Michael thought Henry was imagining things, but decided to clarify. "What's he doing?" Henry replied, completely calmly. "He's looking for his dog. He says they came here together, but the dog ran away, and now he can't find his way home." Michael didn't think much of it, but later told his wife Amy about it. She suddenly turned pale and said, "I've heard that a few years ago, a boy died here on this road. He was hit by a car while searching for his dog." Michael didn't ask Henry about it again, but since then, he started avoiding that part of the road, even if it meant taking a longer route.
Story 18. The Little Secret Room. I worked as a primary school teacher and had a group of 6-year-olds. One day after class, one of my students, Grace, came up to me and asked, "Mrs. Anna, do you have a secret room at home?" I smiled, thinking it was part of her imagination. "I don't have a secret room, do you?" Grace nodded. "Yes, it's behind the wardrobe in my bedroom. Strange people come there, but they are very quiet." This made me uneasy, and I asked, "What kind of people are they?" "They look like shadows. They don't talk, they just watch. But I'm not scared because they aren't evil." I decided to talk to her parents. Her mother seemed a bit concerned. "She's been talking about this room for a few weeks. I thought it was just her imagination." The next day, Grace's mother called me and said that their daughter had shown them the spot behind the wardrobe where they actually found an old door leading to a small abandoned storeroom. No one knew how it got there, but the family decided to close it up permanently.
Story 19. The Little Soldier Timmy. My younger brother Timmy has always been fascinated by military stories, but when he was 5 years old, he started saying things that seriously scared us. One day at dinner, he said, "Do you know that I used to be a soldier?" My dad laughed. "Well, Timmy, you'll be a great soldier when you grow up." But Timmy answered seriously, "No, I already was. In the past, I wore a green uniform, had a helmet, and was in a big battle. We fought in the forest, and there was a lot of smoke." This was strange because no one in our family had told him such stories. I asked, "What happened in that battle?" Timmy replied, "We lost, and I fell into the grass. Then I fell asleep and woke up here, at our house." This conversation stayed with our family for many years. Timmy grew up and barely remembers those words, but when we tell him the story, he just smiles mysteriously and says, "Who knows? Maybe it's true."
Story 20. The City That Doesn't Exist. When my son Arthur was 4 years old, one day he started talking about a city. This happened while we were walking in the park. My wife and I were walking down the path when Arthur suddenly said to me, "Dad, do you know that in the city where I used to live, it's always sunny on the streets?" We stopped. "A city? What city, Arthur?" "The one where I lived before this. It's always clear skies and beautiful buildings, and people always smile, and I always rode my bike. My wife and I exchanged a glance. It was the first time Arthur had mentioned something like this. I asked, "Why aren't you there anymore?" "I came here because Mum and Dad said it's better, and now I can't find that bike anymore." We didn't pay much attention to it, thinking it was just imagination. But a week later, when we were walking in the same park, Arthur pointed at one of the houses and said, "This house looks like the one I lived in that city." He pointed to an ordinary house, which looked like all the others in the neighborhood, but I couldn't explain why he said that. It was strange.
Story 21. The Clock That Doesn't Work. When my niece Melissa was little, she would always make up stories about old things that she or her parents or I had seen. One day, she told us about a clock that stood in the living room. The clock was old, without a counting mechanism, and just decorated the wall. Melissa walked up to it and said, "This clock always stops when people walk around at night." My sister and I tried to ask her what she meant, but Melissa repeated, "At night, this clock always stops. It doesn't like when people walk around the house at night." We laughed at her, but a few days later, we noticed that the clock actually did stop at night. This happened for a few nights, and then the clock started working normally again.
Story 22. Noise in the Attic. When my son Oscar was 4, we moved into an old house in the countryside. It wasn't very big, but it had a huge attic that we didn't use. My wife and I sometimes heard strange sounds like something moving in the attic, but we thought it was just old beams or sounds caused by the wind. But one evening, Oscar started reacting strangely when we were coming home. "Dad, why is someone walking up there?" he asked, pointing to the attic as we walked through the corridor. I looked at him with a smile. "What do you mean, Oscar? There's no one there." "There, that man with the long shadow. He's walking around and looking for my toys." My wife looked at me a bit worried. I answered Oscar, trying to stay calm. "Oscar, there's no one up there. You must be imagining things." But he was insistent. "He's always there, and when I go to sleep, sometimes he knocks on the wall. I don't like it. He wants to take something from me." The next day, when Oscar was asleep, I went up to the attic to check what might be there. I didn't find anything unusual, but when I was coming back, I happened to glance at the wall he pointed to, and there, at the very edge, was a small crack. It was strange because we had checked the house before and hadn't noticed anything like that. That evening, when we heard the strange noises again, I decided to go up there once more, and this time I saw a small old photograph hanging from a hole in the wall. It was an old black and white photo of a man in a suit with a serious expression. It turned out to be a very old picture of one of the former owners of the house, who, according to legend, died here, leaving many unresolved matters. A few days later, when I took down the photo and carefully examined the spot where it had been, Oscar stopped noticing the noise. He no longer talked about the man, and we probably never found out what it all meant. But since then, the attic remained something we preferred not to touch.
Story 23. I worked on the railway. When my son Henry turned 3, he started asking us to buy him a toy train. We bought him a set with tracks, and he began to play, calling the train Sammy. One day he said, "Sammy was my friend when I worked on the railway." I decided to ask him about it, thinking it was just part of the game, and asked, "When did you work on the railway?" He replied, "A long time ago when I was an adult. I wore a big hat and hauled cargo. We had a big accident when Sammy went off the tracks." I was struck by how he described what happened. He talked about how the train caught fire and I could never ride it again. He even added that it happened near a big bridge. A few days later, I decided to look up train accident stories in our state. I found an article about a major catastrophe in 1927 where a freight train derailed near a bridge in Missouri. The description was very similar to what Henry had told me.